A charming woman in her 30s walks down the aisle for the fourth time, smiling at her new husband, promising to love and cherish him until death do them part. Within months, he'll be dead under mysterious circumstances, joining 3 previous husbands who all died shortly after marrying her. Each death was ruled natural or accidental. Each time, she collected substantial life insurance payouts. Each time, she played the grieving widow perfectly, collecting sympathy along with the money. For years, she got away with it because nobody connected the dots. For husbands, for deaths, for insurance claims, all involving the same woman. By the time investigators finally realized they had a serial killer on their hands, she'd already moved on to husband number 5. This is the case of Betty Neumer, the Black Widow of the South, a woman who left a trail of dead husbands across multiple states over 5 decades, and who died before she could be fully brought to justice for crimes that investigators believe included at least 4, possibly 5 murders. Welcome back to Crime Scout, True Stories. Black widow killers, women who murder multiple partners for financial gain, represent a particularly calculated and patient form of serial murder. Today we're examining one of the most prolific suspected black widows in American history, a case that remained hidden for decades because the deaths happened in different jurisdictions over such a long time span that nobody saw the pattern. Betty Neumer was born Elizabeth Ratliff in 1931 in Ohio. She grew up during the Great Depression and married young, as was common for her generation. What wasn't common was the pattern that would follow her throughout her adult life. Between 1952 and 2007, Betty Neumer was married 5 times. 4 of those husbands died under circumstances that, when examined individually, seemed unremarkable. But when viewed together as part of a pattern, they painted a disturbing picture. Her first husband was Clarence Malone, whom she married in 1950 when she was just 19 years old. They had 2 children together and lived in Ohio. In 1952, Clarence died. The official cause of death was listed as a gunshot wound. At the time, it was ruled either an accident or possibly a suicide. Betty was a young widow with 2 small children, and she received sympathy from the community. Nobody suspected foul play. She collected on a life insurance policy and moved on with her life. Within a year, Betty remarried. Her second husband was James Flynn. They moved to Florida, starting fresh. The marriage lasted less than a decade. In 1955, James Flynn died. Again, the death was ruled either accidental or natural causes. The records from that era are unclear and incomplete. Again, Betty collected life insurance. Again, she was the grieving widow. And again, nobody suspected anything sinister. Husband number 3 was Richard Sills. They married in the late 1960s and lived in Alabama. Richard Sills died in 1967. By now, a pattern was forming, but because these deaths occurred in different states, different jurisdictions, and over many years, there was no centralized database or communication system that would have flagged Betty Neumer as someone who'd lost multiple husbands under questionable circumstances. Each death was investigated, if investigated at all, as an isolated incident. The 4th husband was Harold Guthrie. They married in 1968, and Harold adopted Betty's son from her first marriage. By all accounts, Harold was a successful businessman who provided well for Betty. They lived in Ohio and then later in North Carolina. Their marriage lasted 18 years, which was significantly longer than her previous marriages. But in 1986, Harold Guthrie was found shot to death in his home. The case was initially investigated as a possible burglary gone wrong, though nothing was stolen. The investigation went cold. No arrests were made. And once again, Betty collected on life insurance policies. Now here's where the pattern should have been obvious, but decades passed before anyone connected these dots. Part of the problem was that Betty had changed her name multiple times through marriages. Record keeping in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s wasn't centralized or computerized. Deaths that occurred in different states weren't cross-referenced. And frankly, women weren't suspected of being serial killers as readily as men. Betty Neumer moved through life, state to state, husband to husband, leaving bodies and collecting insurance money, and nobody saw her for what investigators now believe she was, a calculating, patient serial killer. Betty married her 5th husband, John Neumer, in 1991. John was a successful businessman in North Carolina, and by all accounts, their marriage seemed stable. Unlike her previous husbands, John Neumer died of natural causes in 2007 at the age of 79. His death appeared to be from heart failure, and given his age, it wasn't questioned. Betty inherited his estate and collected on his life insurance policies. But John Neumer's death finally triggered the investigation that should have happened decades earlier. John's family members, suspicious of Betty's behavior and her eagerness to access John's money immediately after his death, began looking into her background. What they discovered was shocking. They found that she'd been married multiple times before, and that several of her previous husbands had died under questionable circumstances. They brought this information to law enforcement. Detectives in North Carolina began investigating, and what they uncovered was a trail of death spanning 5 decades and multiple states. They contacted authorities in Ohio, Florida, and Alabama, piecing together Betty Neumer's marital history. The pattern was undeniable. 4 husbands had died, several of them violently, all while married to the same woman. All had life insurance policies that benefited Betty. All of the deaths had been ruled accidental, natural, or had gone unsolved. The investigation focused particularly on the death of Harold Guthrie in 1986. Detectives reopened the cold case and began interviewing witnesses who'd known the couple. Several people came forward with disturbing information. They said Betty had allegedly tried to hire people to kill Harold on multiple occasions before his death. One witness claimed Betty had offered him money to murder her husband. Another witness said she'd made similar requests to them. These witnesses hadn't come forward at the time because they didn't take Betty seriously, or because they were afraid, or because they didn't want to get involved. But 20 years later, with the pattern now visible, they were willing to talk. In 2008, Betty Neumer was arrested and charged with solicitation of murder in connection with Harold Guthrie's death. She was 76 years old. The charge was based on witness testimony that she'd hired someone to kill Harold, though the actual shooter was never identified. Betty vehemently denied the charges. She claimed she was being persecuted because of her wealth, that her husband's deaths were tragic coincidences, and that the witnesses were lying for attention or money. The case against Betty was circumstantial, which is common in cases this old. There was no physical evidence linking her directly to Harold's murder because the crime scene was decades old. There were no recorded conversations or written contracts. The case rested on witness testimony and the suspicious pattern of deaths. Prosecutors believed this pattern established motive, means, and opportunity. The defense argued that correlation doesn't equal causation, that tragic coincidences do happen, and that Betty was being convicted in the court of public opinion without solid evidence. As the legal process unfolded, investigators in other states began examining the deaths of Betty's other husbands. The cases were old, evidence was lost or degraded, and witnesses had died or couldn't be located. Building prosecutable cases for deaths that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s was nearly impossible. But investigators remained convinced that Betty Neumer was a serial killer who'd murdered multiple husbands over 5 decades. Before the Harold Guthrie case could go to trial, Betty Neumer died. In June 2011, at the age of 79, she passed away from complications related to cancer. She died proclaiming her innocence, never having been convicted of any crime related to her husband's deaths. The case was closed due to the defendant's death. Justice, if there was any to be had, would never be fully served. The Betty Neumer case raises important questions about how we investigate deaths, particularly those that seem natural or accidental. If the deaths had occurred in the same jurisdiction, or if there had been better communication between states, the pattern might have been identified decades earlier. If insurance companies had better systems for tracking multiple claims by the same person, red flags might have been raised. If the cultural assumption that women don't commit serial murder hadn't been so strong, investigators might have been more suspicious earlier. Financial motive is one of the most common drivers of murder, and life insurance fraud through murder is more prevalent than many people realize. Black widow killers are patient, often waiting months or years between victims. They choose methods that can be mistaken for natural causes or accidents. They're often charming and manipulative, able to convince new partners to marry them despite having a history of dead spouses. And they rely on the fact that most people don't suspect a grieving widow of being a murderer. This has been Crime Scout, True Stories. Betty Neumer may have died without ever facing justice for the crimes investigators believe she committed, but her case changed how law enforcement approaches suspicious deaths and how insurance companies flag patterns. 4 men, possibly 5, died married to the same woman. That's not coincidence, that's a pattern. And recognizing patterns can save lives. Right in one go. No headings, just case discussion with hook. I am using AI for voiceover. Please rewrite as human writing AI Voci and make it professional and easy to understand. Moreover, use proper punctuations to make the real-like voice, the woman who married 4 men, and killed them all. My channel name is Crime Scout, True Stories.